Hello everyone and welcome to the Grow Your Own Regenerative Agriculture at Home webinar series in partnership with Greater Sudbury Public Libraries and Sudbury Shared Harvest. My name is Fiona Tuff and I'm the Youth Programs Coordinator for Sudbury Shared Harvest. Today we are so lucky to be at the growing space, the home growing space of Ron Lewis. He is this is a paradise for ecological home gardeners. There are both annual and perennial food production systems in place, and this offers the best of both worlds when it comes to feeding ourselves. Ron Lewis is a wealth of knowledge, and Sudbury Shared Harvest has been so lucky to connect with him throughout the years, and he's consulted on our edible forest gardens and has supplied the majority of our hardy fruit trees and shrubs that have gone in across the city in all of our edible forest garden projects. So Ron Lewis is a home grower for over 40 years of organic fruits and vegetables, including giant pumpkins in Greater Sudbury home gardens. Known to many as the apple guy, Ron considers himself to be a student of growing food crops and loves sharing his knowledge in hands-on workshops, PowerPoint presentations, and now this webinar. So today we are going to be doing about a 30-35 minute presentation of content, and then at the end we'll have 15 to 20 minutes of being able to answer your questions. So if you are watching through Facebook, you can put in your questions as we go, and we have a team of people behind the scenes keeping track of those questions, and we'll ask them at the end. Keep in mind too, we are on location here, so our internet could be a little wonky, so if we do lose connection, we'll get back on top of it as soon as we can. So without further ado, we'll introduce Ron Lewis, and we are going to be talking about, first and foremost, we have some questions for him, and he's going to be answering them. So through our regenerative agriculture webinar series, we've been discussing the importance of soil health. We've covered the soil food web and all of its complex interworkings, and we really emphasized that the success of your garden largely has to do with the health of your soil. So we were wondering, Ron, what are your yearly soil prepping tasks? What do you amend, and do you have a bit of a timeline for when you get your garden started?
Okay, well, yes to all of those. And first of all, I tend to put whatever organic material is available on my garden every year, but that usually is pretty much the same thing. This particular patch behind us had a few bags of leaves and a few handfuls of chicken manure. This is the only part of my garden, and it's rather large in the back, that was dug by hand. By hand, I mean with a shovel. That's because it was early April, a little bit early to get my tiller going, and I was having mechanical problems with it anyway, so I dug in the leaves and the manure and turned over the soil in early April. I knew I wouldn't have too much of a weed problem, not enough to require newspaper and cardboard because of what had been done here in other years. I'll leave that out for now. So if I turn around, I'll have a hazelnut tree on my right. Down low is a hascap. Then the back towards the house are a couple of grapevines, Valiant grape, and then here's another hascap. The plants that are in the garden itself, the early garden now, were planted on April the 2nd or thereabouts, the first week of April. And not the peppers, obviously, but the onions, and behind them are a few pak choi, which I don't think are doing what they're supposed to do, gone to seed. But I wanted to mention this, and I actually requested this be the first thing done in the webinar. I wanted to mention that most people plant their whole garden on May 24th, long weekend, whatever it is, Victoria Day long weekend. But if you're doing that, you're missing 1.5 months of some of the best growing weather there is for the cool season crops, such as onions. So what I have here are onions that will be harvested as bulbs at the end of August. Right now they're too close for that, so I'm thinning them out day by day and putting them into my supper. And then the peppers, on the other hand, have nothing to do with this whole concept. They are warm weather crops, and they like this location as well. Should I move on my own?
Yeah, sure,
Okay.
sure. And maybe
here,
Ron, can you just speak a little louder? Just
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah. So over here are more cool season crops, and this is just the west end of the same bed. And what's really prominent right now probably are the spinach. The spinach seed was put into the ground the same day as the onion sets over there were, and the spinach is now ready to harvest, in spite of the fact that for a couple of weeks after the spinach seed went into the ground, we had horrendously cold weather in April. And it might have seemed to some people that that wasn't a good idea, but only because I've had experience doing it other years that I know that there's no way that spinach and onions are ever bothered by cold, no matter what. I mean, freezing temperatures, snow, you name it, they'll still come up, and they'll be thankful for the early start because they have small root systems. They don't compete very well with weeds. And the spinach, for example, that we're looking at right now, will put up a seed stock towards the end of June, no matter when it's planted. And so that really shortens its season. I mean, you can't plant a few weeks late and be okay. You're going to lose a few weeks of growing if you do that and harvesting. This little plant in between, covered with little fruits, is Saskatoon bush, known better in Ontario as serviceberry. And then there are a couple more peppers, but also, in this case, a couple of melon plants, muskmelon plants, which have nothing to do with early planting, but they will take over the space once the spinach is pulled out around early July.
And we did have a frost or a risk of a frost last night. Yeah. So you were covering some of your more sensitive crops.
Exactly, yes. Peppers and melons may not have liked the cold weather. Sometimes a crop, say like cucumbers, which are not even up yet in my garden, not only won't stand a frost, but they can't stand anything, say, below about 3 degrees Celsius. So it was necessary to plant those to cover those as a precaution. The temperature did go a fraction of a degree below 1 Celsius last night, but nothing seems to have been harmed, including a few things that in the back that I accidentally did not cover. So a bit of a false alarm, but you have to be careful.
And so when do you feel comfortable working your soil? What does the texture and moisture level need to be?
Yeah, we're not going to find such soil this time of year to really illustrate that, but I can try and describe it. So this is much softer and drier in spite of the fact that we had a lot of rain 2 days ago. My soil drains very well. What you look for in April is, well, the term that's used in all the books that describe this is as soon as the ground can be worked. But what that really means is you stick your shovel in or you pick up some in your hand, you squeeze it and water doesn't run out, so it's not too wet. It forms a little bit of a ball, but then as soon as you apply a little thumb pressure to the ball, it breaks up. That's ground that's ready to be worked in the spring. And usually it's awfully soon, but especially if you have a raised bed and especially if you have sandy soil. It may not be true for clay soils, which can take weeks longer to dry out.
So here we just covered so some of the tips that you put in for soil fertility. So you mentioned you put down leaf mulch, and so like a type of compost in the springtime. Is that right?
I had to do it in the springtime this year because hardly any leaves were put out last fall. We had an early onset to winter. And once you couldn't see your lawn, you're unlikely to do any raking, it turns out. So a lot of people put out leaves end of April, early May, and I grabbed them and put them down. My preference, though, as I do almost every other year, is to do it in the fall. Collect leaves when they're being put out at the ends of driveways for municipal pickup, And I would use anywhere from 50 to 100 bags of leaves in a year, trying to keep the layer of leaves on the soil roughly 2 inches deep. And the measurement is important because I'm going to use the tiller on them. I don't want the tiller to get bogged down just churning up leaves. I want the tiller to go over it fairly fast and, just as I put it, inoculate the soil, inoculate the leaves with soil bacteria. And then over the winter and early parts of the spring, or even late fall too, the bacteria are working on composting the leaves for me. So I put on, as I said, 50 to 100 bags of leaves, which is a lot. By the middle of July, there's no hint whatsoever that there were ever any leaves put down.
Wow.
They're decomposed to the point where it just looks like soil.
Wow. Great. So we just covered some early garden decisions. So putting down some more frost tolerant, cold hardy crops. So spinach and onions. Sometimes kale does well in that regard. Swiss chard can survive as well. We talked a little bit about prepping the soil and when. And so I think now we'll head back to the rest of Ron's garden and we'll get into some more questions. So we're just going to take our stroll. The camera might be a little shaky, just bear with us.
If you want, there's a shot of my rototiller. That answers the second part of your question.
Yes.
When the ground can be worked easily enough in the backyard, which is a little bit later than what we looked at just now, the rototiller does a tremendous job. There's some people who don't like the idea of doing that because of the earthworms that it will kill, or the gasoline footprint, the carbon footprint. But I find it's a trade-off. I have lots of worms in my garden, regardless of having done this for 22 years. And I only use maybe $15 to $20 worth of gas in a whole year. I'm actually finished with the tilling a week ago, and I won't do any more until the leaves are put down in the fall.
Okay. So we have some questions about sort of crop planning and rotation and how you go about planning your garden from year to year. So would you touch on that, like your garden rotation and when you decide? And
okay, well, it's really obvious that there are two classes of plants: the early cool season plants and the later plants. So you have to be careful with those. Nobody in Sudbury who's listening to any advice from anybody would ever plant tomatoes early with the onions, but lots of people plant onions late and then are disappointed that the bulbs didn't size up very much, simply because the onions need long days. And between like April, first week of April when I planted, and say 24th of May, or even now, June 13th today, onions that are planted will grow well. They'll look like this in a couple of weeks, like this onion patch to my left, but they will not form bulbs because you're missing 1 to 2 months of long days before the summer solstice on June 21st. So now, as for rotation, well, any crop depletes its preferred nutrient from the soil. And so if the same crop is planted year after year after year, the yields can fall off, or it can even become more prone to disease as its favorite nutrient is depleted. So I kind of touched on two reasons. You wanted to interrupt insect cycles, and you want to change the demands on the soil by planting different things different years. Okay, so there's all kinds of different systems. They're probably all good. I learned one from a book some years ago that I followed for a long time. It goes like this: root, fruit, salad, seed, and then repeat, repeat, repeat. So root crops are carrots and turnip and parsnip, but also potatoes are usually thrown into that group, even though they're not strictly speaking, a root. Fruit are anything that has seeds, such as tomatoes and peppers. Probably more. I won't try to go through the whole list in any case. Salad crops are the lettuces and spinach. Lettuces and spinach and cabbage, where you're eating the leaves. And seed crops are things like peas and beans and corn, where you harvest and consume the seed, and then repeat. Root, fruit, salad, seed. But there are lots of others. There are 3-year rotations. So what I've done in recent years, though, is I've kind of, with all of this experience behind me, truly, it's because my garden is too big. I've gotten away from that strict following that I did for many years, and I just make sure that I don't plant anything twice in a row in the same place. But I think it's a good idea to do the rotations anyway, the way I mentioned the first time, at the very least, do it some way.
Yeah, that's really, really, really good advice. And we know that crop rotation is really important in ecological production. It means, you know, that it's just about soil health again and mitigating disease pressure and pest pressure. So that's I've never heard that before. So that's awesome. The root, fruit, salad, seed, I think we'll use that at Sudbury Shared Harvest going forward. That's really great. So now we'll maybe touch base on a little bit of actual like technique and cultivating,
Sure.
And watering, this kind of a thing. So something that Ron showed us a few weeks ago was something called blind weeding or blind cultivating or dust mulching. And we're right here in an area that maybe you could show us what that means, or we could walk a little bit if you need.
Just a few feet away up at the onion patch would be a bit easier, I think.
Okay.
So I actually have things planted here, and I'm not 100% confident that I know where they are until they come up.
Okay.
So, blind cultivating is my preferred method. If you can do it, then you're on the ball. And if you don't do it, then you have a much bigger problem to deal with later. So I'll show you. On the right is a loose, dry-looking soil that's already been cultivated. On my left is soil that's still wet from the rain 2 days ago, and it has a little bit of a crust on top. So I try to break the crust with my hoe somehow. No, there's no big deal about the technique, but just to stir the soil. Okay, now what I've accomplished there is I've just killed tens of thousands of weeds that I'll never see. I could scoop up some soil, and you could see the little white rootlets of the weed seeds that are germinating, but they will dry out in this dust mulch, or if they're underneath the dust, they'll never make it to the surface because it's too far to go. What a dust mulch means, if you know what a mulch is, where we'll have an example of that a little bit later, but a mulch is just a material that you apply to the surface of the soil that's intended to keep in moisture and keep down weeds. So the dust that's created by doing this blind cultivation to the surface acts as a mulch. For the term dust mulch, it's not in widespread use, but I have seen it in some books. And I like the idea. It works for me. And it's also particularly working for me, onto your other part of your question, because I usually don't water my plants. You can possibly tell here that none of these plants has been watered. Probably drier in here between 2 onion plants than it is some other places because they were shielded from the rain. But anyway, I'm being facetious there. It's not helpful. The thing is, you don't need to water if you get things in on time so that they have time to put their roots down where the moisture is. It wouldn't be hard to dig down here with my hand and find soil that's much moister than the surface soil, which is dusty. So although a plant might look like it needs water based on the soil surface dryness, it possibly doesn't. Look at the plant itself for signs. Now, if you're just an indoor gardener starting to do outdoor gardening, You probably have to do more watering than what I'm saying because the plants indoors are in pots with very limited space for roots to grow. But outdoors, the plant can grow to its natural depth, and it quickly does that if it's given a chance. But if it's watered frequently after you plant them, after you plant the onion sets, anything, the plant will grow roots very close to the surface, expecting that daily watering. And then you take a couple of days off and go to camp or whatever, and the plant dries out completely and dies because it was unable to get down quickly enough to the moist area that I just demonstrated exists underneath the plants and actually exists at all times of the growing season, no matter how dusty and dry the top might look. I've had soil so dusty on the top in my dust mulch that it can blow away on a windy day. That's not good, of course, and that's extreme, and it hardly ever happens. But underneath that is a lot of moisture that plants can make use of.
Yeah, so that takes us into some of the discussion about watering we had, and that is kind of the more, well, you have a great technique about watering and not watering and why. And if you could just explain that again. I know you just did a little bit,
Okay.
but essentially the idea is the more you water, the more water the plant needs.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly. And yeah, so I guess I would call my method tough love. I'm treating it what some people would think of as harshly at the beginning, but I get a payoff all through the rest of the season. I've been able to go on holidays for 3 weeks or more at a time in the summer, come back, and my garden is fine except for a few very large weeds, but not very many weeds at all, ones that were missed, whatever. And I don't know if you want me to get into a bit longer story about my neighbor who used to water his corn.
Yeah, talk about the corn.
Sure.
That's a good example.
Corn is an example of a plant that really doesn't need water. In fact, it probably does better without it. So it's at the extreme end of what I'm talking about. But I do this non-watering with almost everything, with everything. Years ago, I used to be walking home from work and I'd see my neighbor watering his garden every day, including his corn patch. He had corn 6, 7 feet tall. My corn was 3, 4 feet tall. And my corn would fall over at night because we had such a severe drought that year. It was wilting. It would actually lay on the ground. Then in the morning, it would be standing up again when the sun stress was no longer present. And I didn't know what to make of this. This is one of my earlier years of gardening. It didn't look that great, but going by the books I was reading, that's what I was supposed to do, dryland farming. And I think the reason that I did it was because we were on well water. And in the droughty summer, when the plants needed water most, that's when we didn't have any. So I was sort of forced into that method, and then it worked much better than I thought it would. Anyway, the end of the story is my neighbor went away for a few days, probably to camp. The neighbor who was watering his corn every day. At the end of those couple of days where we had temperatures in the high 30s, his corn was crisp and dead. My corn was still wilting at night, standing up during the day, and I had a wonderful crop of corn in the end. Of course, this couldn't persist forever, and he didn't because his plants were dead. So that really convinced me that you want to encourage your plants to put down deep roots by not watering them unless they show you that they need it. Now, they do need it when you're first transplanting, the day of and the day after, maybe for even a week, up to a week after that, but not that much, not more than they need.
That's such a good story. I like that one, and that we're learning a lot on our end of things too.
The biggest fault with gardeners is overwatering.
Yeah, overwatering.
Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So we're just taking a look here at your pea patch, and you had mentioned earlier you weren't super happy with the germination there, but instead of just being discouraged, you actually planted some some kind of an interesting crop that some folks might not think would grow up here. They haven't sprouted yet, but could you talk about that
Sure.
process?
Yeah, so I'm terribly disappointed with the peas. Actually, there's only about a 10% germination. I don't know why. But in between the plants that missed, in between where plants have missed, let's say we'll take this rectangle, for example, between those two plants, there would have been a plant every 2 inches, a seed every 2 inches, peas. So that's a lot of peas that didn't come up. So what I've done, I'll call it unintentional succession cropping. I never planned a succession crop here, but it would have been good to, because the peas usually don't take the whole season. And I planted soybeans. Now, everybody up north knows that soybeans aren't planted up here because we don't get enough heat and we don't have a long enough growing season. And I agree with that, as if you're trying to grow soybeans to harvest the bean, yes, you're right. It'll never happen. But I'm trying to harvest the pod at an immature stage that you'll find at Japanese restaurants called edamame. So it's very edible, it's delicious, it's nutritious, and it can be grown quite easily. I've done it a number of times. So I have followed the pea planting with an unintentional soybean planting.
Nice. And now we're still talking about seeding, so maybe we'll head over to the other side of the garden and you can talk about how you keep track of your rows using early,
Yeah.
like radishes and things.
Sure.
We'll go over there.
Okay. This row of plants started off with a double row of beets. These are red beets, and although there are some misses, they don't require any of the marking you're just talking about because they come up quickly on their own. But there was, and there is, another row of parsnip in here. And parsnip seed, possibly the longest one I know of that to germinate, it takes 3 weeks. So by the time the parsnip seed would have germinated in 3 weeks, there'll be a lot of weeds crowding out that parsnip plant. And what I do instead is, instead of letting the weeds do that, is I plant a radish every 20, 30 centimeters or so in the parsnip row. And the radish come up in just a few days, and they tell me where the row is. So now I can get in really pretty close to the radish plants with my hoe and do the cultivating that prevents the weeds that would otherwise overwhelm the parsnip plants. And I'll be able to harvest some radish as well. The parsnip will grow slowly. They germinate slowly. Like I said, they take 3 weeks, but they also grow very slowly. So they're not actually harvested till the middle of October, when they might be up to 4 pounds in size. If that's what you like.
Yeah. Another thing, we don't have an example right in front of us, but this question comes up sometimes, is about the benefits of direct seeding cucumbers and squash and melons and these kinds of zucchinis, pumpkins, direct seeding versus, which means putting the seed right into your garden in the outdoors, versus growing the seedlings inside and then transplanting them. And if there's a better way to do it, knowing we have a bit of a shorter season up here, or what the trade-off is.
Okay. When I address a question like that, I'll say, I'll offer you an alternative way of doing it, but not necessarily a better way, because I just don't know which is the best way. But cucumber seeds, in my experience, direct seeded into the ground in the outdoors, will catch up with transplants, because any of the vine crops, cucumber, squash, and so on, in particular, suffer transplant shock. It means they just sit there and do nothing for a while, and meanwhile the seeded plants are catching up. Possibly, it's all, so the seeded plants are also always growing in warmer weather. I actually did that since you were here visiting last week setting this up. But I have nothing to show because none of them are through the ground. But I'll mention what has happened other years. I have found, I'm not a zucchini fan, by the way. I think it's just pure pressure that causes me to plant zucchini at all, but I do. No, they're a great boost for any gardener because they grow so well. But anyhow, what I found was several years in a row, I planted my zucchini on July the 5th. It was probably when I got home from a work assignment in Toronto. And I'm harvesting zucchini from those plants on August the 5th, 31 days. So that's days to germinate plus days to grow. And then all the month of August, I'm wondering what to do with all this zucchini that I don't really like. But anyway, it's a good illustration of how you can have it. You can have it that way. But it's not necessarily a better way, because I know like some of my friends who plant zucchini in the house and they transplant them early, they're eating them a lot sooner than I am. But then a lot of the planning, if you want to call it that I do, is to have something to harvest, but not everything to harvest all at once. So I really wouldn't want zucchini coming in middle July, end of July, when I'm going to be busy picking berries, that kind of thing. You know, so it's take your pick, whatever seems important to you.
So I have 3 more things that I really want to make sure we get through.
Yeah.
So one of them is just, again, addressing how you're amending this soil. So if this is the same deal with the 2 inches of leaves, and if you're putting anything else down, like any animal manures or anything like that.
Yeah.
The other thing is there's some tips for helping your carrots germinate really well. I'm not sure if it's at the same stage, but we'll still talk about it, because carrot germination can be a really hard thing to achieve. And then we do want to go and visit your garlic patch and talk about that.
Okay.
So if you want to talk about the
this
amending.
patch that we're standing beside right now is my newest patch. I only started it 4 years ago. As far as conditioning the soil goes, it had a lot of clover in it. I think I'd planted it white clover, and clover is a plant that enriches the soil because it draws nitrogen out of the air and puts it in. I won't get into the details of how it does that, but it does it. And when you till it in or turn it in with a shovel or a spade or whatever your favorite method is, it returns all that nitrogen to the soil. So this patch actually was productive right from the start, which surprised me. I think I grew tomatoes and peppers there. Sorry, tomatoes and potatoes. And I'm sorry, what was the last part of your question? Are we into carrots yet?
No. So just again, so you do the 2 inches of leaves in the fall, ideally.
Oh yeah, I would do that anytime I'm gardening, anywhere in my garden if I can, if they're available, and most years they are.
Okay.
So a couple of inches of leaves, but in order, first I would spread chicken manure. I have chicken manure that comes from a good friend of mine in the form of almost wood chips.
Okay.
She uses wood chips as bedding and changes it fairly often, so there's not a great deal of breakup of the chemical breakup or biological breakup of the manure or the chips. But the chips have absorbed quite a bit of the nutrient from manure and probably the microbes. Anyway, chicken manure is very strong, very, very strong. And so it's not a bad idea to have a dilute manure, or have only a low concentration of the actual chicken manure in there. So leaves, okay, so anyway, the chicken manure goes down first, because you put the leaves down first, and then you try tossing chicken manure on top. The chicken manure settles into the leaves and you can't tell where you put it. So you can see that you've covered the ground properly if you put the manure down first, then the leaves. In other years, I've used horse manure, and I would use any manure that's available: horse, pig, cow, anything, chicken. But what I always do, and I'm not saying do this, but I have my reason for doing it, is if the manure is fairly fresh and contains a lot of weed seeds, then by applying it in the fall on top of the the leaves, or underneath the leaves, I'm sorry, it has time to mellow. And in the spring, it probably gets tilled at least 3 times before anything is planted into it. That aerates quite a bit, and it seemed to be satisfactory. The chicken manure is just what I've been using, say, the last 3 years, since the farmer that I used to get my horse manure from has passed away, and his horses don't exist there anymore. But whatever is available, and there usually is stuff available if you take a drive out into the country, you'll see.
And in one of our last webinar, which was a pre-recorded one, we talked a little bit about the general components of the like nutrient composition of different types of animal manures. So again, chicken is very high nitrogen, high sodium as well. So you want to make sure it's pretty well composted, because it potentially could burn your plants or do something like that to it. So if it's well composted, if you're doing a fall application, it does have that time to mellow and be incorporated and everything like that. So for our carrots, should we just stay here, or?
We should move.
Okay.
And here I'm taking a big chance because I've had those carrots covered when you visited last week.
Yeah.
And I really don't know what's happened to them.
That's
Since
okay.
certainly we haven't had ideal weather.
That's right.
But maybe we'll get a try. As we'll point out as you pass by, asparagus has been coming up every once in a while. Now, it's easy to tell where the carrot rows are because they're the ones that are covered with the boards. So at the beginning here, I have some circles of direct seeded cucumbers, which haven't come up yet. And we've had so much cold weather, I'm very inclined to want to plant seed again there rather than take a chance that they might have rotted in the ground. And here you can see some of the tens of thousands of weeds that will come up if you don't do some hoeing with the ground ahead of time. An alternative that some of my gardening buddies use is to wait till the weed grows up to about waist high, and then you can pull it without having to bend over. But I think by that time it's probably done quite a lot of time. Anyway, underneath the board are carrots. The carrot rows have also been marked by radish, as we talked about earlier. So I'll take a chance here and flip this over and see what's happened. And oh yeah, okay. There are some carrots germinating. There's a radish. There's a radish in between carrots germinating. So actually, because the stems of the carrots are quite white already, it's time to turn the boards over or remove them altogether, which is ultimately what happens. Here, down there's some. It's not a good germination though, so I may have to put something in between, maybe even more carrots. Carrots are fairly fast, and they're one of the things that you can use to fill in gaps between other things that don't come up, as long as you plant them by, say, mid-July. To our left there.
And so I don't want to.
Yeah, go ahead. No, it's all right.
But we're
the next row is over here.
So when we're seeding the carrots, the benefit of using the boards, what are some of those benefits?
Yeah, well, what happens is the carrot seeds are small, and they're only planted 1/4 of an inch deep. So it's if we happen to get a heat wave during that time, the soil is likely to dry out before the carrots can germinate, even if you water them. And so by putting the boards there, it's just shading the carrot seed from the sunlight. And just until they germinate, maybe that was a day or so ago, but I was hoping for a better germination anyway. I mean, more seeds germinating than we have. And that's all. So the board serves its purpose, and it gets thrown back in the lumber pile. Although, yeah, there are lots and lots and lots. Now, it looks pathetic right now. But in a couple of days, those carrots will be standing straight up.
Mm-hmm.
The white part will be green, and away we go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've certainly struggled with carrot germination at some of our gardens, and some of it was we just didn't have very good irrigation systems, and so they kind of need this like constant moisture until they germinate.
Yes.
So if you are working with, if you don't have a soaker hose, if you don't have drip irrigation, this is a really great technique for just keeping that moisture in. Also, when you are seeding your carrots, if you have a big sprayer on your hose, there's a chance that you're going to displace those carrot seeds. So sometimes on my end of things, I'll actually on a smaller scale, I'll water first and then put my seeds in and then cover them, and then that way the hose isn't pushing them aside. But so they do like contact, so that's the board also helps with that. And on some larger scale farms, they'll seed their carrots, and then they'll go with an implement on the back of their tractor, and actually it's called a roller, and it actually rolls and compacts the soil on top of it. But then they'd also have constant irrigation or very consistent irrigation until they germinate. So these are really good tips for at home.
The rolled soil would dry out later than loose soil would.
Right, so that compaction helps with that.
I can offer one suggestion here, but again, I'm not entirely sure that it's true, but I'm working on this theory. Sometimes we use straw for mulch. In fact, I love straw for mulch if it's available. But I have found, I think, this is the theoretical part, that straw inhibits germination. So right now I can see, as I look back, I can see 2 cucumbers that have germinated in that little circle. But other years where I've tried covering the circle with straw right after I planted, the seeds have never germinated, never. So I'm suspecting that the straw has that inhibitive power. Now, once the plant is germinated and has started to produce a vine, then you can work straw around the edges, place straw around the edges, and it will work as a mulch and suppress everything else. So that's why I'm going to stick with boards, and I'll wait till other people try maybe straw mulch on top of the carrot seeds to see whether that works for them or not.
Okay, so let's head to your garlic patch.
Okay.
And maybe as we're walking, Chanel, our amazing camera woman, can take a shot of the containers that were next to all of Ron's frost-sensitive crops that he covered last night because we were worried about that frost. So it's as easy as, placing pots over your plants. Of course, if you have tarp or row cover that you purchase, that works as well. But essentially, you don't want whatever. Oh, perfect. Essentially, whatever you want to save, you want to keep whatever is covering your plants off from touching the actual plant as well.
We're talking about garlic and
squash.
So the garlic is planted in the fall, like probably everybody else's garlic, and that is because garlic needs a cold shock to sprout. So spring planted garlic sometimes doesn't do anything unless we get a cold spring, such as we had this year. But often that's the case. So anyway, they're planted anywhere from end of September to mid-December, really. I know those are the extremes, and most people plant in October, which is good. But if you've missed the times when most people are planting and you'd like to plant some garlic in the fall, you should still do it anyway, as long as you can dig up your ground. It's not frozen. Because all that it's really doing, it's not doing a whole lot of growing in the fall, it's just being sprouted by the cold of the winter. Now, these garlic then were planted last October. First week of July, they'll form a little loop and a stalk called scapes. I was going to say the name escapes me.
Yeah.
But I won't say that. And yeah, so the scapes can be harvested separately, and people use them in their salads or stir fries or whatever. And then the garlic itself will be finished by the end of July, first week of August. You'll be able to tell when it's ready to harvest because about 60% or so, I mean more than half, say, of the stalks and leaves will be yellowish, brownish yellowish. You can't leave them in longer than that because the garlic bulbs in the ground will start to come apart, and then they're not very good for storing. So the timing has to be about right, but really that's pretty easy because there's not a whole lot else going on in the garden, especially in terms of harvesting in the last week of July, first week of August. Now, what I have here, usually my way of planting the garlic is put the seeds in. You notice I'm planted in double rows, but can't really argue that that's better or worse than anything else. I've got 144 plants. Then as soon as I've planted it in the fall, I immediately put down some leaves if they're available, and then cover the leaves with straw. The main reason for the straw is to keep the leaves from blowing away. If they dry out, they can blow away. And that may still happen later in the summer, except that I've got some straw ready to go. Okay, now, this will help us review what we said before about mulching. The mulch keeps the moisture in and keeps the weeds down. I think I see a dandelion over here, which I can kill easily enough, but not very many. And this plant has never been, or this patch has never been hoed like the other ones were, and I never will. So there is no weeding, no watering to do the entire growing season. All the work is in October. Okay, so then you harvest your garlic in the last week of July and first week of August, depending on what symptoms it gives you. And then you've got this empty space. So that is an invitation to plant something else. What I have done last week is I moved some of this leaf mulch out of the way in 4 spaces, one at each end here, one at each end on the other side, and I planted some squash, which hasn't come through the ground yet. May have to be replanted after the cold weather we've had, because squash is a warm weather plant. But anyway, the squash will grow. I'll be able to harvest the garlic by walking up the middle row, and the squash won't be there yet. And then after the garlic has been removed, the squash have all this space to ramble around, which they will use. And squash is, I find, a very reliable crop. I get squash every year, no matter what. Yeah, so the other thing was, it's a good way to demonstrate just how much moisture there is. If you look at these leaves, they're wet from the last rainfall, and the soil underneath is wet. And if I were doing this in July, I wouldn't describe it as wet, but I would describe it as moist and cool. And that's why mulch is really valuable, especially if you're short of water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great example of using the space in your garden to your ultimate, just using it really, really well. As you know when you're going to be harvesting a certain crop, and you know that within that time, some other crops can size up and use that space. So that's really great.
Yeah, I forgot to use the technical term. When you have one crop after another growing in the same space, it's called succession planting. If you want to look things up, there's a lot of discussion of that in a lot of books.
Yeah, and sometimes
internet articles.
They'll go into detail of like really good succession, like plants that complement each other, that kind of a thing, that grow one after another. There is so much information about that. Mm-hmm. And the other thing about garlic is we talked about that, in a few weeks, we might start to see the garlic scape. So the garlic scape is like a very firm, we can't see it now, but it's a very firm sort of stem that will come out of the very top, like in the crevice part of the garlic. It'll shoot out like this, and it'll grow in a curlicue, very similar to like a pig's tail. And on the end of it, you'll see a little white tip. And the reason we're snapping that off, or what I understand to be the reason, is because that little white tip will actually, if you don't snap it off, will actually become the flower, the garlic flower, and it'll contain very, very tiny garlic seeds that are called bovules. And those are very, very tiny. And so the reason we're snapping it off is so that the energy goes into creating a bigger bulb. So That's my understanding.
Yeah.
And if we left the seed on, and actually, like, all of the farms that I've worked on, we've snapped them all off, so I actually don't know what the garlic would look like if we left the seed on.
Same here.
But you can use those garlic bobules that grow in the flower. You can plant those and it will become garlic, but it'll take a very, very long time for them to size up. So when you plant that garlic bobule, the next year, in the fall time, the next year, that garlic bulb is going to be tiny, tiny, tiny. And so year after year after year, you would have to keep planting it and planting it until it gets bigger and bigger. And when we're planting garlic, we're actually just planting one clove. So we plant one clove of garlic, and that equals this whole plant, and it equals an entire bulb in the next season. So it's a very cool crop, and garlic scapes are delicious, like Ron said. You can make pesto out of them. You can saute them. They're really an amazing food.
Yeah. On that, my information is that it takes 3 years to grow harvestable garlic bulbs from bulbules.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah, so that was meant to remind me that you use about 30% of the bulbs that you harvest for planting next year's crop. So it can seem like an awful lot, but by the time you've given some away to your friends and relatives and saved 30% of what you originally harvested for planting, it's hard to have too much garlic. But again, it's not very labor intensive, certainly not during the main part of the growing season.
So I think we probably are ready to take a couple questions.
Oh, yeah.
So I think Chrislyn, our other behind the scenes awesome lady, is going to read out some of the questions that came in.
Yes, I will. And thanks for all the questions, by the way. Somebody named Sarah asks, when do you plant tomatoes and cucumbers? Given that it has been cold the last few nights and a frost warning tonight, is covering them enough?
Well, covering them has to be kind of defined, but it should be enough given the extent of the frost that we're supposed to get, or the depth of the frost. In a normal, like, there's different systems that people use for determining when to plant things. 24th of May is popular, but there would have been a lot of frost since then, or at least cold nights. June the 10th, right? June the 10th, you'll almost never run into this if that's your day of planting. So it's hard to know exactly when, but certainly you can't cheat too much. You can't plant them, say, early May. You certainly wouldn't plant them with your onions or anything like that. But I find it fairly satisfactory with what I've done here, where these were planted about 2 to 3 weeks ago, and then I cover them. When we're expecting cold nights. But I mentioned that covering them has to be kind of defined. So here's the thing. I have these pots. If it were going to be very cold, I could lay plastic or some type of cover over the pots, like a blanket. But if you lay plastic or a blanket right directly on the plants, you might crush them. So that's kind of my answer. Every one of my answers is kind of iffy because I don't really think there are right and wrong ways to do things usually, but it's just alternatives. Anyway, yeah, don't plant your tomatoes with the early crops. So.
Thank you so much for that, Ron. Now, Christina Donato asked, so many great tips. What did you mean by dust mulch again?
Dust mulch. Well, dust mulch is what you end up with. Not really doing anything. Is if you're blind cultivating like this, where you're breaking the soil surface, then you end up with a dust mulch. You end up with a layer of dust on top, which is not objectionable, even though it's dust. It doesn't look great, but it's not objectionable because what it does is, to some extent, it acts like a mulch, in a sense, 2 ways. Holds moisture in, smothers weeds. So it's mulch and it's a dust.
That's all the questions. Yeah. Do we know what time it is? So is there anything else that you want to share with us, Ron, in the next 5 minutes?
Oh,
Anything you want. This is
Yeah.
your pick.
I'd like to let people know, if they don't already know, that it's possible to grow a lot of fruit in Northern Ontario. Look around, there are grapes and plums and apples and cherries, haskaps and sea buckthorn and so on. Hardy varieties from the prairies, that's important.
Do you want to talk about your strawberries and the different varieties, day, neutral, everbearing?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to start, say, 150 years ago. Strawberries came as male and female, so you had to make sure that you planted a few male plants which wouldn't have any fruit to fertilize the female plants, which needed pollen from the males. So that was when people first started growing strawberries in home gardens, 50 or so years ago. Then, fast forward to, I don't know when, sometime in the middle of last century, it was discovered that some strawberries are ever-bearing, so-called. And all that term means is that they'll have a second crop. So they'll have a late crop in June, a light crop in June, when most strawberries would be producing. And then they have a heavier crop in late August, September. Okay, now fast forward again to not very many years ago, and breeders have developed a new type of strawberry called day neutral. Day neutral is just an improved ever-bearing type. It has a crop in June and a crop in late August, early September, but 2, 3, or 4 things. The crop in June is heavier than the ever-bearing's crop would be. It's comparable to a typical June-bearing strawberry crop. The crop in September is good and goes right into hard frost in August before, in October before it quits. June, September, October. In between, it will also flower and have some fruit, though, during the summer, except for the very hottest months. So that is what I think everybody in a home garden, at least, should be growing: day neutral strawberries. There are a number of different varieties. Mine are called Seascape. Pointing with my hoe, that row is brand new. It was planted in the spring. Tiny little plants that you could hardly see, and now they're doing okay. The middle row is a remnant. The one to the left of the new row is a remnant of my previous patch, and the row on the left is kind of a write-off because it's been infested by the grass that's growing nearby. So I want to always have 2 rows, and therefore I'll always replace a row that's infested by a new row and try to keep doing that, and then maybe work my way back.
And we've had those day neutral berries in some of our edible forest gardens, and so that's been really amazing to see them continue to produce throughout the season, late into the fall. That's been really amazing.
Sometimes people think that things that are not popular are inferior, but that isn't the case. I'll use tomatoes for an example. It took around 100 years for tomatoes to be accepted in the United States. It took President Thomas Jefferson standing on the steps of the White House to eat one in public before people thought it was okay. Until then, they thought it was poisonous. So the fact that something isn't well known isn't a good reason not to try it out. It's better to read and find out what some of the experts say. And day neutral strawberries are the way to go for strawberries. There's all kinds of tomatoes that are early, and there's some kinds that are so late that they'll never ripen. There is 90-day corn, which you'll never see. I mean, you'll never pick a crop. And there's 58-day corn, which is what's suitable for up here. And they're not inferior. Just because they're not grown in the main growing regions for those crops doesn't mean that we can't do well with them up here. We do tremendously well.
Mm-hmm. Is there a number of days, like for me, if I see anything that's 110 days, I sort of steer clear. I know it's a risk. Yeah. So I usually go for like less than 100 days.
Are we talking tomatoes?
Any crop.
Well, squash might be up there with that, but it'll be okay.
Yeah.
Tomatoes in particular, because they get a late start and they can't really catch up unless you Don't count the number of weeks that you have to keep them indoors ripening them. I don't think that's desirable. But okay, well, the numbers I gave for corn at about 59 days. I don't think I've got a tomato here that takes longer than maybe 70. Some of them would be 62, and a few of the new ones, Evans on the extreme left over by the red bucket, and Lata here to my left beside this other red bucket. Those are in the high 50 days. And those are experimental to me. I can't really say if they're good. They probably. Got more?
We do have one more question, but
Sure.
we're at 12 o'clock, so
Okay.
a new one came in.
Oh, a new one?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, we could ask it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Ron, and also Sarah, I'll get back to your clarification and via Facebook message after this webinar. And Christina asks, I want to get cherries or hascaps, but I'm worried they will attract crows. Tips?
Yeah, I don't know about crows in particular, but a lot of the smaller berries, hascaps and cherries and grapes are often harvested by birds or chipmunks. So the cure for that is to put a netting over the plants as those fruit are starting to ripen or starting to turn color. Say are starting to turn color, because good cherries will turn red and the birds will eat them, but they're not harvestable yet anyway, and they can't ripen off the tree. So you'd be stuck. The netting works, but the downside of the netting is the common size of netting is 1 inch by 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters by 2.5 centimeters. And a bird can actually get caught in that, so can a chipmunk. So if you can find, and there are some nettings with smaller holes than that, they'll actually prevent the fruit from being attached. It's really worthwhile. Fruit is so good.
Well, I think that about does it. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you so much, Ron. Your garden is so wonderful. I learn so much every time we talk.
Thank you very much.
So you should have been a professor at my farm school. So stay tuned. We're gonna have more grow your own regenerative agriculture at home webinars coming up in the future. In another week or so, we'll have one on home composting and a bunch of different techniques and types of compost. And stay tuned for that. So if you do have any questions, you can get in touch with us at Sudbury Shared Harvest. You can email us or use Facebook, and we'll get back to you with any pressing questions. We may also be doing some sort of one-on-one garden coaching. So if you have any questions about your home garden, we can maybe come and visit you, but we're going to be offering some one-on-one coaching as well. So thank you so much. Enjoy your weekend. It's beautiful. Watch out for frost. Cover your plants. Take care.